propulsion continues to be normal.
Alright, the chamber pressure looks good.
Doubling up. Roger, roll, Atlantic.
Water towers can fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight downside, SCE off. Say again, SCE off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.
And good evening, good night, good morning, or good day to wherever you are around the world, and welcome to the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where you are looking across at the Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, specifically Pad 40, where a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket is preparing for a liftoff on the Starlink 5-4 mission. Liftoff is currently targeted for 0, 10, and 10 seconds Eastern Time, or 5, 10, and 10 seconds UTC today. And this will be quite a mission for the Falcon 9. This particular booster is one of our higher flying ones, though not quite a record. But I mention a record because if there is indeed a liftoff at that time, there will be a record set. So, as they are go for propellant load, let's go around and introduce who we have on comms with us today. Joining me, actually in the back channel, pushing the buttons, pulling the levers, and making the photons fly to all of you is Mr. Kevin Michael Reed. Kevin, thank you so much for being here and helping us all out. And also joining Kevin in the back channel for some robotic tracking operations today is Mr. Michael Baylor. So, Michael, thank you very much for that. Indeed, can't wait to see what those long-range trackers get of Falcon 9 tonight as it lifts off. And joining me on comms in his studio down in South Florida is Mr. Sawyer Rosenstein. Sawyer, how is it going today?
It is going fantastic. We've got Team Florida here for you tonight for tonight's launch from Florida.
Indeed we do. Sawyer giving away who else is on comms here tonight. Manning this camera that you are looking at right now is Mr. Thomas Berghart. Thomas, how's it going out there in the field tonight? Staying dry?
Yeah, it's going well. It's perfectly dry out here right now. In fact, we got mostly clear skies, plenty of stars out. And hoping that weather holds off for just a little bit while longer. SpaceX's most recent weather prediction came in at 60% go for the opening of today's window, which is, like you said, 12:10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5:10 UTC. And they are go for propellant load, so they're going to try and hit the opening of that window. There's weather coming in from the central west side of Florida. However, we are hoping that it stays out of our way, because right now it is a beautiful night to go to space.
Indeed. And just before we get into questions here, for those of you who are longtime viewers of our channel and those of you who are new, go ahead and send us your questions through chat here on YouTube. You can tag us at NASASpaceflight, and that will allow us to see the question very quickly here in a wonderful program that Michael built for us that tracks all of your questions. So with that, but before we do that, I just wanted to thank Space Nut for becoming a Red Team member 6 hours ago when we very first made this stream live. Thank you so much for that. And then 5 hours ago, thank you, Starship 24, for becoming a Launch Director member, one of our highest membership levels and the highest levels of support. So thank you so much. And then Jim Cavett, less than an hour ago, gifting a Red Team membership. So if you were the recipient of that Red Team membership, let us know in chat and give Jim a thanks for that. That type of support really means a lot to us, and it was just really nice to open up the panel here today and see all of those for hours before the stream actually began. And we have crossed the T-minus 35-minute mark, which means the auto sequence has started, and fueling of the Falcon 9 is underway for launch. And Thomas... and actually, before I throw it to Thomas, you can see the timeline of events there for the countdown from propellant load to liftoff. We'll be keeping track of those and ticking them off as they go. But Thomas, since we are now into propellant load, There is something special about this mission tonight. If it launches at 12, 10, and 10 seconds Eastern time here this morning, there's a record that it breaks, is there not?
Yes, and they even have a little bit more room should there be. I mean, at this point, they're in the auto sequence, so that's the time they're targeting. And as long as it goes tonight, this will hold true. SpaceX is going to break a record tonight, or going to attempt to break a record tonight, for the quickest turnaround of any of their launch pads between flights. Today's flight would break the record overall across all three of their pads, which was also set back at Pad 40 earlier last year. And this is part of SpaceX driving up their launch cadence, both here in Florida, out in Vandenberg, in pursuit of as many as 100 flights in a calendar year. Whether that happens this year or in the next couple of years, they're already on pace to shatter their record from last year, which was 61 launches in a year. And I'll someone with the article in front of you if you want to pull the actual numbers, but they're beating the previous record by like 4 or 5 hours. Some of that obviously comes down to what the launch window is. You can be ready for launch. If they were ready to launch technically 10 hours ago, but the launch window for this mission isn't until now, some of
Right.
that comes down to chance and random chance, but they have to be prepared for it. And it's a combination of factors between the launch pads, vehicle readiness as far as what boosters do they have around, new upper stages, refurbished fairings, payload readiness, drone ship availability. There's a lot of factors that go into SpaceX and continuing to improve their launch cadence. But today's record that we're keeping an eye on is the turnaround of Slick 40. Recently supported the Amazonas Nexus mission. In fact, that was the company's most recent flight, and they are
Yes.
already launching from this pad again with the Starlink mission tonight.
And just to put it in perspective, because you said, we do have those exact numbers, and I do not blame you for not remembering this little piece of minutia. I don't think I could either.
Yeah, it is. It's like very specific to the minute numbers that I wasn't exactly going to memorize.
Yes, it is. But if they lift off today, they will beat the record and the record they will set is 5 days, 3 hours, 38 minutes from Amazonas Nexus to Starlink 5-4. And that will beat the previous record, which was 5 days, 9 hours, 28 minutes. So today is 5 days, 3 hours, 38, and the previous record was 5 days, 9 hours, 28. So beating it by a few hours here, and the weather definitely looks like it is going to cooperate. There was a little bit of a question about that, and we'll come to the weather in a little bit because we do have some questions about that. But wanted to get to another a quick question that we had here for Sawyer. What is the drone ship for tonight?
Okay, for tonight, for the marine assets, I'll do my best to make Gav proud. We have a Shortfall of Gravitas located approximately 660 kilometers downrange, ready to catch this booster on its 12th flight. Also downrange, about 654 kilometers offshore, is the ship Doug, which will be out there attempting to recover the fairing halves from this mission.
There we go. And thank you, Kevin, for that graphic on screen. You can see the southward trajectory Falcon 9 will be taking here tonight. There's a little bit of a dogleg maneuver with the second stage to properly maneuver into that desired orbit today. And specifically, that is a 43-degree inclination orbit that they are shooting for. And there you can see the drop zones and the landing locations as they bend around the Bahamas to get into that. But before we get to our next question, I just wanted to thank Dougal for 5 gifted Red Team memberships and Nerd Plays Game for another 5 gifted memberships. Very much appreciate that amazing support and continued support. And Teresa, thank you so much for becoming a Padrat member as well. Very much appreciated here. But Thomas, here is a really good question that's going to link to something that Cody is saying. He's asking, come on, weather, let me have a launch on my birthday. So happy birthday, Cody, first and foremost, as we see the security helicopter going by Falcon 9 in the background there.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what that is. It's not a UFO or whatever's going on in the northern part of this continent right now that NORAD's responding to. But Thomas, this is a good question because the weather was a very iffy thing earlier today, correct?
Yes, and before we get into that, I should point out the frost is starting to become visible on the rocket, a visual indicator that propellant load is well underway by this time. But yeah, the weather was the big question mark going into today. The L-1 forecast from the 45th Space Wing here at Space Launch Delta 45 indicated just a 20% chance of acceptable weather during tonight's window, which of course made us all a bit skeptical that weather was forecasted to be much better 24 hours later. So I think a lot of us were half expecting at least a 24-hour delay for purposes of weather. However, they kept an eye on it throughout the day, and right before, about an hour before the window opening, Space has confirmed that the weather forecast had improved to 60% go. So still not guaranteed. Obviously, weather's got an hour to do what Florida weather does, actually about 30 minutes by now. But so far, it's all tracking okay. So SpaceX is going to give the opening of tonight's window a shot. And like I mentioned, you can see that weather is moving west to east. It's not a whole lot, so we could get lucky even if it starts to get into the area. As long as it doesn't break any of those launch commit criteria rules, we should be able to get this rocket off the ground. The weather is moving in from the west, but we're hoping that it stays out of the way just long enough to get this mission in the air.
That is indeed what we're hoping for. And the weather complexes that you were mentioning, Thomas, like the nearest little storm cell is about 40 kilometers or 25 miles from the Cape down to the south, and not really a huge particular threat. What they'd mainly be looking for is like anything that might develop very close to the area right now, basically. So, as you said, Thomas, fingers crossed for that particular one. So let's keep going here. Sawyer, real quick, because I know some people are interested in this. We know this is a Falcon 9 mission, but we also know that a lot of you are interested in Starship. And we do have a question here about does SpaceX released any information on damage to the OLM after the booster's 31 engine static fire the other day?
From what I've seen, the latest, you may have more information probably on that. From what I saw, this was only a 50% approximately static fire of the engine, but the pad seemed like a little bit of charring. And right now, also, you can see on the screen there live from our Starbase live cameras, ship 26 doing a little rollout there. But I'll let you answer a little bit more about the exact damage details. You can see them working on the bottom right there.
Yeah, I mean, from what we know, I mean, it doesn't appear that there was like show-stopping damage to the OLM. Some form of damage was expected in repairs and inspections, but in terms of like SpaceX saying anything official, no, they have not, in that regard. Alrighty, and Broken Heart here with a good question saying, when orbit? Well, T minus 26 minutes. And I know that's not what you meant, but I couldn't resist doing that. This question clearly relating to Starship, but I thought that would be a nice joke to throw in there and draw people's attention back to the countdown at hand. But when orbit, no set date yet for Starship, but could be as soon as March, based on the good performance that we have seen or heard so far from the static fire of the booster that occurred on Thursday. Glenn Hobson also saying massive thank you to whoever just gifted the membership. Apparently, Glenn was one of those recipients. So, Glenn, enjoy your Red Team membership there, gifted by one of our wonderful members here. And speaking of, we will rocket you. Okay, good one. Thank you for gifting one Red Team membership as well. Yeah, and here's another good question for Thomas. Sai is asking, why does SpaceX not clean the soot off the Falcon 9 rockets?
Great question. So, very early reuse flights of Falcon 9, you saw the boosters mostly got a full cleaning. You could kind of vaguely tell that it was like slightly darker than pure white. This is back before Block 5 Falcon 9s were even a thing. Nowadays, they have flown and reflown enough boosters and have plenty of data to explain that the scorched in the soot that starts to build up on these boosters is not a huge amount of mass. It's not a huge amount of the change of the aerodynamics of the rocket, where it's just not worth the added refurbish time between flights to just clean it off. There might even be some sort of PR/salesperson angle to say, look how cool these flight-proven rockets are, and look, this booster's been to space a bunch of times. It'll reliably take your payload or whatever. There could be some stuff going on, but the engineering decisions they've got plenty of data to show that basically the effect of that stuff is negligible. It doesn't affect rocket performance, so why waste the time, energy, and resources to clean that off in between every flight? You do notice between flights, if you get a close-up of a rocket like out on the pad, like if we go out and set remote cameras or we're taking pre-launch photos, every once in a while you'll see certain seams along the rocket are cleaned, or little spots here and there, and those are the spots they're looking at to inspect the rocket between flights, inspecting weld seams and stuff like that. So you'll pick that up if you get up close, pick it up before launch of a flight-proven rocket. But other than that, there's no reason to clean the entire thing. That's just extra time that would delay the next mission, so they have stopped doing that.
There we go. Thank you very much for that, Thomas. And also looking here at some questions. So, yeah. So, here's a good question, Sawyer or Thomas, for either of you. Oh, I just accidentally deleted it. Oh shoot, I did. Oh man, I missed the question. I don't remember it. I'm so sorry. Let me move on to a different one. Here's a good question. How do they name the Falcon 9 missions?
Well, goes into a couple different things. When it's a customer payload, the customer names, whatever satellite or whatever is going on. But there are a couple of missions where the naming designation comes from SpaceX, such as these Starlink missions. Today's mission is the 5-4 Starlink Group, and the two numbers have two different meanings. The first number, the group 5, is basically what class of the Starlink constellation, like what shell of the constellation these satellites will go into. Group 5 has so far been aiming to support one of the first shells of the second generation constellation. So these satellites, even though the satellites themselves are identical to the ones launched on all of the recent previous Starlink missions, they have all the most recent upgrades, but they're not anything compared to like the Group 4 missions that were recently finished, or the Group 2 missions that are flying out of Vandenberg. The satellites are the same, but they're going to an orbit that was part of the second generation constellation. They've basically just started to populate that constellation with the same satellite hardware. That's not to be confused with the fifth shell of Generation 1. The group numbers have not necessarily coincided with the shell number, so there's a bit of a differentiation there. Starlink naming conventions are a bit confusing. But it's going to Group 5, that part of the constellation, and then the 4 is simply this is the fourth mission in support of that shell. They don't always launch in order, because especially if one of those missions also has a rideshare payload attached to it, and then the rideshare payload has some sort of delay or something, oftentimes those missions can launch out of order, and the naming convention just stays with that mission. But that's how you decipher the Starlink naming convention. You also have the transporter missions, which are rideshare missions from SpaceX, and the number is just the order and flight that they fly, and stuff like that. Otherwise, external customer missions are usually just the name of the satellite that the customer has bought a Falcon 9 launch for.
Gotcha. And Sawyer, here's a good question from Sai, who, and this is a great question because we always say like, hey, like these streams are meant to educate everyone. Space is for everyone. We want everyone to understand. So if we ever say something that you don't understand, let us know. And this is a great question here. What do we mean when we say orbital inclination? So like today's orbital inclination for this particular mission is 43 degrees. So Sawyer, what do we mean by that?
It's actually a really great question. So when we talk about inclination, it's kind of basically how tilted it is when it orbits around the Earth. So when you think of basically the inclination around the equator would be 0 degrees. So it's kind of on a bit of a tilt. So if you were to say tilt the equator 43 degrees, that's about where the satellite would have its semicircular orbit. The reason that the inclination changes typically is based off of where you are trying to get coverage from that satellite. So if you're looking for a specific location and it's within that 43-degree range as it goes around, you get wider coverage areas. Hopefully that makes some sense. Basically the tilt of the orbit.
Gotcha. And also a good one here, Thomas, from Arjun, who's asking, when we say dogleg maneuver, why is it? Oh, and there is our big T-minus 20-minute vent. I'll throw the question back to you in a moment, Thomas. But this event is basically Falcon 9 saying, I'm happy, I'm healthy, and I have my full load of RP1 kerosene on board the second stage. And what this vent is gaseous nitrogen that is being pushed through the propellant lines of the transporter erector. That's the gray structure that sort of braces Falcon 9 as they put it up vertical, and then it goes through the fueling process. And they load the RP-1 kerosene into stage 2 first, and then they stop. They purge the transporter
wow.
lines. Wow! And there is the
Sorry.
full moon. There's the moon, not the full moon, but there is the moon rising as Falcon 9 is venting happily away. T-minus 19 minutes and change still on the clock. Great view there, Thomas, of the moon.
What a color.
Thanks for not telling me on the question. I had to adjust the camera when it appeared from the lower clouds there. Yep.
Yes, indeed.
Oh.
Clouds still a factor tonight, but so far looking good on the overall weather forecast for the liftoff attempt 19 minutes from now. But as the T-minus 20-minute event continues, Thomas, a good question that we got here is, when we say dogleg maneuver, what do we mean by that, and why do we call it a dogleg maneuver?
Yeah, well, you know what? I don't know the origin of like dogleg specifically. It's referring to the turn that the rocket will do. And this happens on a couple of different missions, many of which Falcon 9 has flown. Today's mission is flying southeast from Cape Canaveral towards that 43-degree inclination orbit. Now, normally, this orbit would be targeted with a northeast trajectory because there's nothing out there in the Atlantic. You have all the room you need. However, this time of year, the weather in the North Atlantic is not great, especially when you have a drone ship that's going to try and catch a Falcon 9 booster. So to combat that, they fly southeast, and that requires just a slight turn to avoid overflying the Bahamas. So that's the reason for the trajectory, the dogleg in the trajectory. It's very slight on this mission. There's a more dramatic dogleg that occurs when Falcon 9 goes on the polar launch corridor out of here, flying south towards a polar orbit, because then you have to steer around much more of Florida. But sometimes they do that as well. We've even seen them do a dogleg out of Vandenberg. Actually, a couple different launch providers have, to avoid parts of California and Mexico when flying to certain inclinations out of there as well. So it's not very uncommon. A lot of times you try to avoid doing that because it is a performance loss. The rocket expends a little bit extra energy making that turn, but a lot of times it's not a huge deal, and it's worth it to make the recovery operations easier, such as with tonight's Starlink mission.
The reason it's called a dogleg is if you look at it from a satellite image, in particular, like on a golf course where they have dogleg holes, it looks like a dog who may have his arm slightly bent, like when they go to sleep, how they kind of have their paw bent and their head on top of it. It's got that kind of look, like a bent dog leg.
There you go. Great question there. And gosh, what a great view of the moon there. As we cross the T-minus 17-minute barrier here. Going to do a couple of quick questions here. One from Trent saying, just making sure you all are still going live for NSF Live tomorrow. We are. In fact, it is the three of us who will be doing NSF Live tomorrow. So Thomas, Sawyer, and I will just transfer right on over to that for our live show tomorrow. So yes, if you do want to join us for our live show where we talk about the most important things that happened in the previous week and a look ahead to the coming week in space activities. Join us tomorrow, every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time is when we do our Sunday live show. So mark your calendars and join us there. And as we, before we take another question here, as we approach the T-minus 16-minute mark in our countdown, this is when that big purge that you just saw the transporter erector do, this is when it will transition to start filling the second stage with its densified liquid oxygen, which should have just begun. Meanwhile, the first stage is still being filled simultaneously with its RP-1 kerosene and densified liquid oxygen. But that is where we are right now. SFS Inverted saying thanks so much for the coverage. Curious how many Falcon 9s does SpaceX have in their fleet right now? The answer is about 20, which includes active and reserved. So basically every booster that has made it past McGregor is the answer to that question. Thank you so much there for the support as well. Nate Saunders gifting 5 Red Team memberships. My goodness. Cole gifting 1 Red Team membership, and Ethan becoming a PadRat member. Thank you so much for all of that support, and to all of you who got one of those gifted memberships. I hope you really take advantage of it and check out what that membership level offers. Also, Wolfram saying $20 to the Gator Defense Fund for the field crews. Thomas appreciates that, especially on a night like tonight.
Always appreciated. Always appreciated.
Yeah, we dress him up in the. Yeah, we dress them up in razzle dazzle to confuse the alligators. Bonus points if you understand that reference. And Anon with a good question here saying, you guys mentioned turnaround time, but when does that stop? Is it once the mission window opens and not when the launch actually occurs? So, great question. We clock turnaround time liftoff to liftoff is how we calculate that, and is generally how turnaround times on launch pads are calculated. It's liftoff to liftoff.
And that's actually a very, very good question. And I mean,
Yeah.
there's certainly an argument to be made about, okay, the pad was turned around in less time than that because it was ready to go, even though liftoff didn't happen because of either the launch window hadn't opened yet or the rocket had a problem that was unrelated to the pad or whatever. Like, it's obviously a different metric when you are actually analyzing how quickly can the pad support two launches theoretically. Um, but a lot of times we don't have insight into every specific detail. We obviously know when liftoffs occur. That's what we base it off of. But when you're actually trying to figure out, what is the maximum launch cadence that SpaceX could support right now, it doesn't just come down to how quickly can you get two liftoffs to occur. It's how quickly can the pad be ready to go again? How quickly can you get another Falcon 9 integrated with a refurbished booster, a new upper stage, refurbed fairings, and your payload? How quickly can you turn around or get a drone ship deployed? So the other factors are actually how you would do an engineering analysis on this situation. But for the sake of record keeping, liftoff to liftoff is a little bit more straightforward.
Indeed it is. And I remember the question that I accidentally X'd out, so we're going to go to that next. So it is a question about the second stage, asking, can't SpaceX just build the second stage in a way that can be recovered?
That was something that was discussed very early on, of possibly fitting it with landing legs, possibly having a parachute, catching it with a giant net, kind of like they were talking about originally with the fairings. I believe one of them was a kind of like a trampoline even. So it has been looked into, but as of right now, the easiest thing for them to do is just burn it up in
Build
the atmosphere.
Starship.
Well, yeah, yeah, exactly. That will be fully reusable, but until then, right now they typically, after the mission is complete, put them into a spot where it's one final burn, and they will destroy themselves in the atmosphere, leaving no space debris, and anything that does survive the atmosphere splashes down into the ocean, and as you can see on this map, for this mission, it will splash down the second stage just south of South Africa.
We go for that. All right. And another great question coming in from Zachary, who's asking, which active booster is the fleet leader? Which is a great question. There are actually two. Thank you to Alex for the fact check on this. Real quick, they are booster 1058 and booster 1060, both of which currently have 15 flights to their name. So those are the fleet leaders as of right now.
And just for reference, 1058 launched in December and 1060 launched in January, so they recently hit 15.
Indeed, they did. And North Coast saying, when will Tom Cruise go to the ISS to shoot that movie, and will it be on a Falcon 9? Yes, good question, because there was that announcement that Tom Cruise would be going to the ISS to shoot a movie, and then very shortly after that, we basically began hearing nothing else about that. So the status of that mission is unknown, but yes, it would at present be on a Falcon 9. Thomas, here's a good question. Why do the 4 launches of the Group 5 Starlinks all have different numbers of satellites? Are they testing something?
Aha, the million-dollar question. So we can certainly speculate to this regard. Sometimes it comes down to factors it most likely comes down to vehicle performance. The reason why vehicle performance may be changing, the exact insertion orbit, the initial insertion orbit that Falcon 9 is going to go into, is not identical on every mission. And that has been informed especially recently by things like solar activity, because if you remember last year, SpaceX lofted a whole bunch of Starlink satellites, and then Earth was immediately hit by a solar storm, which
Yes.
inflated the Earth's atmosphere and caused a bunch of the satellites to re-enter, all but 10 or something. And SpaceX says, well, that was dumb. We shouldn't do that again. And so now they insert them a little bit higher, and they're definitely closely monitoring solar activity based on how high do they need to insert any specific mission. So that likely influences the performance ever so slightly, where the number of satellites may change by 1 or 2 here and there. Could also come down to the exact orbit they're targeting, the orbital plane they're going into, and if the upper stage needs to do any slightly different steering here or there to match up with other satellites, that could come down to it. There's with it when the changes are that small. I mean, literally between these missions, it's like 1 or 2 different numbers of satellites. It's hard to know exactly what extremely small thing might be affecting the payload mass on that particular flight. But those are the kind of things that influence it. Exactly where the upper stage is inserting that group of satellites is probably the most dominating factor.
Gotcha. And yeah, it very much complicated answer to that, right, Thomas?
Yeah, it's not easy to make those calculations, and that's why they have a whole team of engineers to do them.
Yep. And just for reference,
they
this
do,
orbit will be initially about 298 by 339 kilometers with the end goal of a 530 kilometer operational altitude. Of course, that is after the liftoff and the first stage then comes back to land on the drone ship, which I
And
love that landing sequence.
Speaking of the drone ship landing, if you would like to celebrate those landings on the drone ship, we do have some apparel that you can drape yourself in or put your favorite human rated fuel in as well if you want to definitely feel the burn that the Falcon 9s do as they come in. I love this design from Pauline, and I really love how she captured the entry version of that with the heat shield made of fire. But I really, really love this design. So definitely, if you want to celebrate how the Falcon 9s have made landing an art form on the drone ships downrange, head on over to shop.nasaspaceflight.com and check out the merch. We've got a lot of stuff in there. You can keep warm with the landing burns in your hoodies, or put some, like I said, coffee, right? Coffee. Everyone needs coffee. Exactly. So, but rockets also need a different type of fuel. And as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, Falcon 9 is finishing up its fueling process here for the anticipated liftoff of the Starlink 5-4 mission coming up at 12:10 and 10 seconds Eastern Time, or 5:10 and 10 seconds UTC. Until we get there, here is where we are in the countdown right now, approaching the 7-minute mark where Falcon 9 will begin engine chill down. Basically what that means is this is in reference to the 9 Merlin 1D engines at the base of Falcon 9, and they achieve that engine chill down by slightly opening the liquid oxygen valves in the tanks and allowing some of that liquid oxygen to flow into the engine's lines, so that the engines are cooled down into their proper start ranges and are not thermally shocked at ignition at T-minus 3 seconds. So that is where we currently are in the count, and SpaceX launch ops confirms that that has indeed started. So let's keep going with some questions here. Ripa with a good question. Is there the possibility of a jellyfish tonight? I don't think so. Nighttime jellyfishes created by the moon require really, really clear conditions and an almost full moon to make out. And with the amount of moisture in the atmosphere and the angle of the moon, I really wouldn't expect it tonight. Night jellyfishes are very rare. Miss Bob with got one of those gifted memberships. Wonderful, and I hope you do enjoy that that gifted membership. We've had a lot of gifted memberships tonight, which is really nice, and thank you all for all of that support. Another good question that we are seeing here that regards payload capacity, Thomas. Does SpaceX always fill the payload to near max capacity for cost and efficiency, or do they tend to run lighter loads?
Before you answer that, really quick, stage 1 RP1 load is now complete.
There you go. Thank you, Sawyer. Yes, so depends on the mission. For Starlink, that's an internal payload where they can, like we kind of touched on earlier, they can fluctuate the exact number of satellites based on the flight profile and things like that. So for Starlink missions, it is basically the maximum payload that Falcon 9 can do with the acceptable safety margins for stage 1 landing downrange on a drone ship. That is what determines how many satellites are on any given flight. Occasionally, it comes down to payload volume. So if you have satellites or payloads that are less dense but take up more space in the payload fairing, sometimes it's just as big as the payload fairing is. That's more rare. It's almost always a mass constraint if you're going for max payload. But sometimes also, especially for customer missions out to geostationary orbit and stuff like that, it's not so much a maximum mass to that specific orbit. Or rather, it's not that that's the most mass Falcon 9 can deliver to any geostationary transfer orbit. Those are the most common example. Oftentimes, the satellites are less than Falcon 9 can handle. However, they will take that extra payload, that extra performance in the form of extra energy into that upper stage and use that to give the payload a bump, a more favorable transfer orbit so the satellite can reach operations faster or something like that. So every flight is more or less optimized in one way or the other for either the most mass they can get up on that flight or the most favorable insertion orbit so that the payload has to do less work. That said, some missions do still result in very healthy margins that are well below maximum orbit, especially those missions that are return to launch site missions, where the booster actually has so much extra energy that it can come back and land at a landing zone. Those usually have very generous margins as far as performance goes.
And actually, on this, what you can see right now, there was the transporter erector beginning its pullback to its pre-launch position of roughly 88.5 degrees. There, it will remain there until the moment of liftoff, 3.5 minutes from now, when it will throw back to its 45-degree angle. You can also see the payload fairings there, which will be attempted to be recovered from the ocean today for eventual refurbishment and reuse. Those fairings were in some degree steerable at some point, but they have now just gone to letting them largely just passively splash down in the ocean under parachute descent. But another good question here. I know we're getting close to the liftoff here. I just want to note that we do have a good question on engine shutdowns that I am saving for when we arrive successfully at those milestones today. But I do just want to hit very quickly as we are very close to liftoff here. And Thomas, I know you're probably going to sign off and for the tracking shot there with us, but I just want to hit a question here from Mark and Macebob, who are asking about the Soyuz and Progress leaks that have now occurred with 2 Russian craft. Macebob asking if SpaceX will need to send an extra Dragon due to the Soyuz. The answer to that is no. Roscosmos is actually sending a backup Soyuz to replace the Soyuz that is leaking. But for those unfamiliar, this morning, when just after a new Progress vehicle, Progress MS-22, docked to the International Space Station, another uncrewed Progress vehicle, Progress MS-21, leaked as well. And Roscosmos is currently investigating that. That is an uncrewed vehicle, so there is no need for a Dragon crew vehicle response to that.
Yeah, that's currently only loaded up with trash to be burnt up in the atmosphere.
Right, but
there's a great article on NASASpaceflight.com if you want to learn more. But yeah, I'm going to head off for camera tracking. Thanks, guys.
Yes, but with a minute and a half left, we return to Falcon 9 for today because, as you can see, the back end of our countdown gets very, very busy here. We do have a couple more questions that we will hit after a successful liftoff here, but with a minute and 20 seconds, you can see that we do end up in a very busy part of our final countdown here with flight computers taking control, propellant tanks being pressurized, and our final go for launch poll.
Right, that final vent there indicates stage 2 LOX load is now complete.
Indeed, it is. So one big milestone that you will see. There's the drone ship, and there's Falcon 9. Just for what flashed on screen, there the drone ship, A Shortfall of Gravitas, waiting to catch the booster today. But with 40 seconds to go, Falcon 9 has entered startup. It has taken control of the countdown, and it has pressurized all of the tanks in the first and second stages to their flight levels. This gives them the rigidity.
Go for launch.
This gives them the rigidity that they need to survive and actually provide the structural support for Falcon 9 as it ascends today.
Apologies for interrupting there. We have the go for launch as we approach about 15 seconds to liftoff. We're standing by for that green flash at the bottom of the rocket of the T-tab, which will ignite the Merlin 1D engines ahead of liftoff. And there we go. We have liftoff of Starlink 5-4, setting a new turnaround record at pad 40, and it has cleared the tower, and we will let you listen to the beautiful launch sounds.
And what I loved, if you were listening very, very closely to the audio from Thomas's microphone, you could hear the VAB doing its resonant squeal as Falcon 9 ascends into Florida's dark night skies here. You can see good altitude and velocity as the vehicle is passing through about the 10 to 12 kilometer altitude range, leaving that vapor trail behind it exactly as expected for a kerosene oxygen burning engine. And here's one of our tracking cameras for this particular mission. So far, so good. This is Thomas's tracking camera. So this is the manual track from Thomas right now. You can see that plume expanding. That's not because the engines are changing their thrust. That is because the air pressure is changing. And it is, as Falcon 9 ascends into the less dense atmosphere, the plume expands in the upper atmosphere, as you can see here from one of the long-range trackers as well. Next major event here will be the shutdown of the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the base of the Falcon 9 first stage, followed quickly by stage separation and the ignition of the Merlin vacuum optimized engine on the second stage.
Those are all kind of happen within seconds of each other, and then the fairings will separate just shortly after that.
And for those wondering on there you go, you can see engine cutoff there, main engine cutoff on the booster. And here we go with stage separation. Green flash ignition, and the stiffener ring releases as the Merlin vacuum engine ignites. Here go the payload fairings as well. And the moon. As the payload fairings disappear, you can see the moon in the background there. So this is what I start to love, Sawyer. This is the Falcon 9 first stage on the left-hand side of your screen with its telemetry data, and the second stage with its telemetry data on the right. And you can see both, and you can see the velocity of the first stage decreasing as the velocity of the second stage increases, which is exactly what we want to see right now.
We got a fantastic view, too, with the lighting of the...
Oh, wow.
I was going to say of the grid fins unfolding, but look at that beautiful view.
That is pretty good. Which camera is this? And for those who are wondering, we did just see the payload fairings separate. Those fairings were being flown for the 5th and 8th time, so they are also reused payload fairings on this flight. And this is one of the cameras on top of our facility at the Kennedy Space Center with Michael's AI tracking software guiding it following stage 2 there.
So far, everything looking good. What's also interesting to note is to see that the altitude is still climbing a little bit on the first stage with that leftmost number in the right box, but that will start to drop as it then reaches its apogee and prepares for its landing.
Yes, indeed. In fact, with the speed leveling out to 0, it's at apogee right now, pretty much. And now the speed is increasing, so it has reached apogee and is now falling back to Earth. Gravity pulling it back down now as the second stage continues to accelerate. The velocity you can see on the second stage just crossing 11,000 kilometers per hour, roughly targeting approximately 27,000 kilometers per hour, give or take a few hundred for specific orbital insertion targets today. But so far, so good for this mission. 5 minutes into the flight of the Falcon 9, and I can actually hear the rumbling hitting Daytona Beach right now. So that is really cool. The other thing to point out with that payload fairing half that flew for the 8th time, that number per SpaceX, that would be a record number of flights for a fairing half. So maybe not just a pad turnaround record set today, but a fairing half record set as well. But let's talk a little bit about what we are going to expect here in the next few minutes. The booster is on its way down to a shortfall of gravitas in the Atlantic Ocean, just off one of the northern Bahama Islands. The second stage continuing on to orbit with the 55 Starlink satellites on board. This one of the tracking cameras at the Cape still got its eyes on that second stage there. But what we will see next is the booster perform its entry burn. This is when it lights 3 of its Merlin 1D engines to form a protective heat shield against itself and slow itself down a little bit more as it enters the dense lower atmosphere of Earth. You can see on the right-hand side of your screen, this is the onboard camera views for the boosters, and there you go.
There's the entry burn.
With entry, burn, and ignition right on schedule and
It is
at the right
an 18-second
altitude.
burn, by the way. 18 seconds on this one. Which I believe we just caught the landing burn there as well on one of our cameras. And there we go. We have the shutdown of the engines on the first stage there. Its next step will be the landing burn, which will begin in about a minute and a half from now, a little less than that, ahead of a landing on a shortfall of gravitas about 650 kilometers downrange.
You can also see there on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see the booster coming in hot. That is air glow based on its velocity and how it is interacting with the air right now as it descends toward the drone ship. No other light source out there for it just yet, but you can see it is descending down toward the ocean there as the second stage continues onward to orbit.
Yes, and those grid fins will start moving too once we see the next and final engine ignition for stage 1. That will help steer it through the atmosphere and at the very last moment steer itself hopefully to a landing dead center on the drone ship.
Exactly right. Not uncommon to lose telemetry links with the boosters either. Also not uncommon to. There you go. You can see it updating right there as it comes in for its landing here. But and there we go. The landing burn underway for Falcon 9. You can see the grid fins moving to help with the adjustment of the overall trajectory. Down through the clouds we come. And a shortfall of gravitas should be appearing momentarily. There it is, right on cue. Landing legs down, and boop goes the booster. So there you have it, a successful landing on a shortfall of gravitas for this particular booster, a level up, and any second now we will have cutoff of the second stage engine. With an orbital velocity of 27,000 kilometers per hour at that altitude and for the target, that should be a good orbit. We will wait for SpaceX to confirm that. But Thomas, let me know when you're back on comms to hear how that all looked from your end. A great shot there of DOS's favorite view, a happy empty launch pad, and my gosh, the moon hanging above Slick 40 there.
Moon.
Exactly. Oh, exactly. That was a gorgeous launch.
And we have
for those of you who are
of nominal orbital insertion.
There you go. And for those of you who were also wondering, it's 45 seconds into the flight. So T plus 45 seconds is about when you can hear the VAB do its resonance squeal and everything. We did get a few questions about that. So if you want to go back to that particular time index to listen, you can hear the VAB squeal in that time frame.
Yes, Jack and I have nicknamed it the Sonic Squeal.
Yeah, and Thomas, what are you back on comms, Thomas? No, okay, the there was for something else. But yeah, definitely a good night for the initial Starlink mission. Ascent here into orbit, but the mission not quite done yet. The second stage of getting to orbit is definitely the biggest part. I know we all really focus and like that booster landing, but the second stage of getting those satellites into orbit is, of course, the primary element. The second stage is now in a coast. It will reignite its engine for a 2-second burst, 54 minutes, 12 seconds into the flight. That will help raise and circularize the orbit into the final desired deployment altitudes. And then an hour and 3 minutes after liftoff is when the Starlink satellites will actually deploy. Falcon 9 second stage then has to do its deorbit burn and re-enter the atmosphere, at which point mission will be complete for this particular flight. Also, just wanted to thank Ken, who gave us a bit of support there, saying great work as always. Just a thanks. Well, thank you very much, Ken. We really appreciate that support and you liking and trusting us with all of this wonderful and epic space news coverage. Thank you a lot. Moldy Space Industries wouldn't be a stream without Moldy Space Industries. Moldy, how you doing? Moldy with his customary with their customary Thomas fan club. Indeed. Alan gifting one red team membership. So if anyone got that gifted membership from Alan a few minutes ago, definitely give a shout out. Thank you there. Echo saying, see, when the moon hits your plume and it makes your light bloom, that's
a jellyfish.
A night launch. So there we go.
In before copyright strike.
Yes, and also asking here, Nova Raptor was asking to everyone on commentary, are you guys excited for the upcoming release of Kerbal Space Program 2? And I think the answer for that is definitely a yes.
I think that's an understatement, yes. Not like I've been counting down the days with a friend or anything, is already planning the first vehicles I want to try launching, where I want to go. No, of course not excited at all.
Very much so. And here's another good question, and I think this will be one where we can go ahead and wrap up on. Does SpaceX have any plans to add more autonomous spaceport drone ships to the fleet out east? Are they one of the biggest impacts on reuse timing? And Matthew, yeah, you are right on the second part of that. The drone ships are one of the primary factors for the turnarounds out here, especially if they are needed to constantly be out there catching boosters that cannot reserve enough propellant to perform the return to launch site boost back burn. So yeah, they are one of the bigger impacts on the not just the reuse timing, but the overall flight cadence that the Cape can maintain when you don't have RTLS capability on some of your missions. In terms of new ADS, in terms of new autonomous spaceport drone ships, right now the answer is no. There are no currently known plans to add to the current East Coast drone ship fleet.
Correct. As of right now, it's the 2 on the east. Shortfall of Gravitas, just read the instructions. And of course, I Still Love You out west. And in case you're wondering about that cadence and the issues they might come up with, we do have a video on our channel about SpaceX's goal to get to 100 launches.
Indeed. And Man on Mars, thank you so much for the support there. Asking if you could name your own rocket, what would you name it? Thank you, gents. Name it? Like if we're going for a Starship, I want Enterprise for obvious Star Trek related reasons. So that's what I would do.
I'm going to go with the all-time favorite. I know it's already been used for Apollo, for Shuttle, for Dragon, but I'm still going Endeavour.
And J.R. Moore saying, with a 2-year wait for the orbital test and only one successful landing, referring to the starships before the ships before that, why no more atmospheric landing attempts? Which is a great question. They felt that they could move on from it is the honest answer from that. They felt they had gotten the data that they needed for that particular campaign and were good from that standpoint to proceed on to the orbital flight test, specifically, in large part, I would think because the orbital test flight does not plan to grab the does not plan to recover the ship. It plans to let them splash down in the Pacific Ocean, mimicking a landing style. So because they weren't planning to recover it, they felt that they could gain another good set of data points by actually flying the overall mission itself.
Yes. And before we wrap up, if I could just run off some fun facts here for this mission. This marks the 203rd Falcon 9 flight, the 10th launch this year, the 9th Falcon 9 launch this year, because they had the one Falcon Heavy already, and the 5th Starlink mission of the year. This booster making its 12th flight, and SpaceX's 132nd drone ship landing and 171st booster landing. This is also their 97th consecutive successful landing since their previous failure. So, a lot of numbers at you there, but I love my little fun stats.
There we go. Indeed. And I think with that and a wonderful shot of the moon here following a successful initial ascent of the Starlink 5-4 mission, that is going to do it for us on this particular stream. But let's go around the horn and thank everyone again really quick. I was Chris Gebhardt, or I am, not was. I am Chris Gebhardt, Assistant Managing Editor for NASA Spaceflight and your host for this particular stream. Joining me in the back channels, operating the stream, was Mr. Kevin Michael Reed. Kevin, thank you so much for all of your work and all those, and the neat little new countdown graphic as well. Thank you, Kevin, for that, definitely. Also in the background with the auto track was Mr. Michael Baylor. Thank you very much for that and your hard work with the bots, as always, Michael. And then in the field, not on comms right now, but in the field was Mr. Thomas Berghardt, who was operating the camera, giving us this wonderful new moon shot here, and also with that wonderful manual track of Falcon 9 as it headed down the range corridor tonight. Thank you, Thomas, for that wonderful track, and also for a wonderful article too on this mission and the next Starlink mission coming up from Vandenberg later this week as well. And then also on comms with me here in the studio was Mr. Sawyer Rosenstein. Sawyer, thank you so much for staying inside on what was a trajectory that you would have been able to step outside to see.
It's worth it for the stream because I always get the amazing views that we get here from our teams out in the field and the robotic cameras, so it makes it worth it. Plus, you know I love talking about space stuff, especially with our audience and answering questions, so it was a no-brainer.
Indeed it was. So with that is going to wrap up our commentary here for the Starlink 5-4 mission. Thank you all for joining us and staying up or getting up early, whatever time zone you were in around the world. Thank you. We all really do appreciate it. And thank you so much for the support and those who became members, especially those who got gifted memberships and who gave gifted memberships. Thank you very, very much. That support, very much appreciated from all of us, more than we can say. So thank you. Thank you all for joining us for this wonderful mission. See y'all later. Have a great night.
Liftoff. Propulsion continues to be nominal.
RCP chamber pressure looks good. Toggling up. Roger roll with Atlantic.
Water towers fly! Yes!
Tango Delta nominal.
Flight downside SCE off. Say again, SCE off.
Yikes. You bet. Concur. We don't need any more of these.